All right, what we have here is a little bit of bonus content for you all. One of the ways I prepare for our episodes is to jump on a call with my producer, Santiago, and we just kind of hash out some of the issues that are adjacent to what we'll be discussing. I find these discussions invaluable, not only in preparing to create the content, but just in the overall sense of getting a grasp of some of the broader concepts, but also the finer points. And I thought maybe the audience would also benefit from these discussions. So in this instance, we're preparing for our interview with Professor James Naylor, which will air later this month. That episode's going to be about the history of electoral politics, leftist electoral politics, circa 1919 and beyond. I don't want to give too much away there, but I thought we hit the record button here for this session when we got into the idea of leftist coalitions and the urban-rural vote divide. Take a listen in. Let us know what you think. Okay, but yeah, look, talking about, because we talk about coalitions all the time, you have to figure out what that would look like. And, choosing to not run in certain ridings is kind of to me, it feels the same as the way the NDP just doesn't spend resources in certain ridings because they're lost causes. And then you're not speaking to everyone. And you got to get your message to reach as many corners as possible, no?
Kind of, but no. Because it's almost I would argue that it's a very, it's an unrealistic goal, that the idea that everybody is going to line up behind any one thing.
Okay, hold on. We got to bring people up to speed because we've been sitting here talking about this, and that's why we hit the record button, because we're going to disagree on something. And we're looking at the United Farmers of Ontario and the Labour Coalition. I'm using scare quotes because we don't really know if it was a coalition. We're going to find out later when we talk to James Naylor. But right now we're exploring this idea that, the United Farmers of Ontario, clearly representing farmers, a demographic, ran candidates in only certain ridings that they would win, ridings where they represented farmers. And Labour took everything else, the urban centers, whatever it was referred to back in 1919. You know what I mean? So they divided their resources and they won the election. So now Santiago and I are exploring this idea of making that choice of only representing a certain group of people. And, this urban-rural divide still exists. So this is an important discussion, right? How do you then successfully appeal to, how do you socialize farmers again? How do you make farmers socialists again, right? Is this the way?
I think what it comes down to here is the idea of unity versus coalitions. I don't know if unity is the right word there, but it's one thing to have a centralized approach of these, and it's kind of it touches on I guess the myth of Canadian democracy is the way I would put it. This idea that okay, all of these MPs each MP represents the interests of the majority, kind of, not really, of the people in their riding, and then they will represent those interests in the House and vote accordingly.
And they don't.
And they don't. We whip votes. It's far more centralized than that, of a smaller and small. And that's the problem with kind of that approach of, I guess, representative democracy in a way as a whole, is this idea that it's representative at all. It's not. Right? Because it's always a smaller and smaller group of people, and it gets funneled, and and at that point it's almost like presidents, and I mean, it kind of goes against for people. I mean, funny because we just did the national episode for people who are patriotic about it. Goes against the very foundation of what this constitutional what's the word of our democracy, what's the word, parliamentary democracy. It goes against the idea of a parliamentary democracy. We don't have a parliamentary democracy. We just LARP as if we had one.
I mean, no one's going to argue that all the parties fail to represent someone. And like the NDP is failing to represent farmers, right? They're losing that rural vote, even though historically there's been precedent set for organizing there and having socialist values reign supreme there at the polls. But I don't know, when I typed that out, that question to James Naylor, it didn't feel right to describe a party as only representing a certain demographic, because perhaps that's okay just from a legislative point of view, like getting seats in a space where you can ensure farmer-friendly, rural-friendly policies get passed, right? Because those things just get lost in the big parties, right? They're really urban-centric, most of them, and the discussions around mostly urban issues. But if it's also, if you look at it from a socialist working class perspective, though, that's a bit of a division of the working class, no? Especially like if you did a Canadian politics, you'd be leaving out a huge swath of people and explicitly kind of saying this is only for them. That would be difficult.
I guess, though, in a way, that is what I'm saying. Like, I guess a little bit, like, and that's the thing is, I actually, like, I would then argue against the working class term as being enough in all situations always. It's not.
I agree.
Like,
I agree.
It's useful in terms of like I think it's useful at the highest level, which is like the very fundamental elements of our society being like this conflict between the ruling class and the working class, and that distinction there is helpful. But when you bring it into like the smaller things and you bring it into like a parliamentary democracy and there are different interests. People are different. People have different needs and different lifestyles and things. And I think it's okay, like, I think it's okay that like some people are urban, some people are rural. Like, my goal is not for everybody to be urban,
No, but our goal is for everyone to be like progressive in their politics.
Yes,
like,
but that's the thing is that I think that's what's important. Is the progressivism. I think you can be progressive on both, but progressivism, socialism, whichever flavor, it's also not a one thing, there isn't a, like, whatever, like, even if you say like democratic socialism, something like that, right? There isn't one democratic socialism. There's no one anarcho-syndicalism or whatever, like whichever one right. you pick, there are still going to be, like, if we lived in a democratically socialist society or an anarcho-syndicalist or a communist or libertarian, whichever flavor, within that, there would still be conflict from different people having different ideas and needs. And they could still be just as validly socialist. But there's still different needs that need different advocating. And like socialism is more about like that like more macro level structure of like the relationship between the like workers and ownership, right? That's really like what socialism is. But once you get that, there's still a difference between the needs of farmers and city people. There's still that difference. And I still think that they deserve different representation, or not different, proper representation. I think that they deserve somebody who understands their unique needs and will advocate for it. And I hope that it is within the socialist framework. But even if it's not, I still think that they deserve, in a way, to argue against it. They'd be wrong, and hopefully we could do something. And that brings up whole conversations about just how you structure these things without being authoritarian.
See, well, it's about structure, because I'm thinking like if you had a well-structured political party, one that like we've kind of discussed as a utopic idea, that elections weren't the be-all, end-all, right? That isn't the big W. It's the education that needs to be done across the Canadian political spectrum, right? To bring people on our side. And that work, if it's so centered on just winning the election and not ingraining that messaging on a united front to a degree, because I'm curious as we look at the labor and the UFO and why in the end it didn't work. why that didn't work. So if you're choosing to represent those, but still have shared ideals, right? Like if you're going to, we wouldn't say out to the cons, like the NDP wouldn't say to the cons, okay, we wouldn't cross boundaries. Like there has to be some sort of political alignment for you to give up a riding to another party. But then how do they work together? Are they working together? And if they're not, then that wasn't really a success.
Mm-hmm.
But if anybody knew how political parties get candidates for all of these ridings, I think your argument is bolstered, Santiago, because right now, we talked about paper candidates before. That's what happens a lot of the time in this rush to claim you represent everybody, but you don't, right? You don't. All of them mostly represent capital interests for the most part. But that aside, it's almost like a clout thing. Like you need to have a candidate in every riding to be taken seriously as a party. So how receptive would Canadian folks be that are engaged in politics? How receptive would they be to a party that was just like a women's party? Or
I just thought of something horrible.
Oh, no.
Well, just like the success of the Bloc Québécois almost speaks to it a little bit, right?
Eek.
I mean, that's the bad example.
I didn't expect to open that can of worms.
But it's kind of what it is, though, right? Like,
yeah, no.
They represent the francophone.
That's what I meant when I typed that out. And it was like a party. I was trying to describe what we were talking about. It was a party that would only represent a certain demographic. And we're talking rural urban. So that's lucky because it's a geographic divide. And we do cut up our country into geographic areas to vote in, right? So that is more plausible than my suggestion of a women's party. And it's why you can have the Bloc Québécois, because it does represent like a region that we've actually axed out borders on. So it's far more doable. And so often we explore that question on like why the NDP, the working class party, or, even the Greens struggle to a degree in rural settings.
But that's where I would also almost bring up the example of Latin America in the sense, like I'll bring up Colombia, right? Like in Latin America, the left does exceptionally well in rural areas, but it's not applicable to all of Latin America. But in Colombia, we have coalitions, right? Like the Pacto Histórico, which is the current ruling party. It's not a party, it's a coalition of, like all of them. I mean, there really isn't there is individual parties, but they build coalitions, and those coalitions run. You don't run under any one party's banner, you run under a coalition banner. And those coalitions like represent different segments, because it's also like and it's a little bit less applicable to somewhere like Ontario, which is, while it is a wonderfully diverse place, it's actually, you're not separated by big mountain ranges, so it's not like completely different. But in Colombia, like the needs of rural people, not just farmers, but rural people on the Pacific coast versus the Atlantic coast, or on one side of one mountain range or the side of the other mountain range. The conditions are completely different. We have like entirely different ecosystems, and so it's not going to be as universal there. It's a little more here, but my point is like, I think that like those needs are different, but that doesn't mean conflict. I think that's the whole myth of the working class in general, right? Like when I say like urban and rural issues, so many times it would be hard to, other than things that are agriculturally based, really draw a line between urban and rural issues. Like, I think the idea is to understand, this is me being almost idealist though. Like if you look at a society, right? Like a country, we just did a nationalism episode, so we can talk about how like even the concept of the state is a problem. But we have states. So let's look at states and say, okay, it's an ecosystem in a way. Like an economy is an ecosystem. It's built up of all of these different parts working together, right? Like you need agriculture to be able to feed people. You need like the energy, and different people in different places provide different things, right? And if the leadership is, if within like the parliament where like people are supposed to be making these decisions, there's not the right people who understand how each of those individual things work, how can we properly figure out how to make the whole thing work? Right? That's what I'm advocating for here. Is that,
in
like,
theory, that should be working already, right? Like, you do elect someone local, you know, like they...
But the NDP doesn't know shit about rural.
I know, but I feel like we always get back to this place where it's like the NDP is so bad, we have to start a new party to do something. So, like, we need now a new one to represent urban folks, and then we need a new one to represent rural, and then...
But that might almost be easier. That might almost be easier,
that
though.
That divide isn't as clear anymore. You know, even though it's geographic, like, I'm going to take my riding as an example. York Simcoe, you know, we're probably going to lose it in the reshuffle, but it, you know, I'm a city girl. I'm a transplant from Toronto, but so when I call these little urban centers, to me, it feels silly, but there are somewhat more urban settings within our rural, and a farmer's party definitely wouldn't represent, in my mind, the diverse amount of people that live here, especially since a lot of folks are like me and driven from the urban centers from cost and are now living here. So, like, how does that divide now look when our agricultural is also structured a lot differently? Like, that might be in Colombia. I don't know the situation there, but whenever you have folks that own the land and till the land and work together in cooperatives, they're going to react in a whole different way politically than what we have,
in a way,
with a few exceptions.
Like, this is coming to a much bigger, almost philosophical question or ideological question, and it reminds me a little bit of conversations of anarchism, in the sense that, like, well, in a way, like, any centralized system cannot fully represent everyone, right? Even if you had 300 and is it 338? How many right? Whatever. I'm gonna assume it's 338.
It was.
Even if you had 338 parties perfectly tuned, like if Parliament was made up of like every individual MP stand on their own, and there was no party, and each MP was as close to possible as representing the diverse needs of their riding, even then it wouldn't be fully representative. Even then it wouldn't represent everything. And that's kind of the flaw.
Right? Cabinet essentially shapes almost everything.
No, but even forget about cabinet. Each individual MP could still not represent the diversity of goals and ideas of their riding.
They don't. We elect the wealthy. That's our leadership cult.
But even in the ideal, even if we had the perfect candidate for each riding that perfectly encapsulated their thing, they still wouldn't represent everyone. That's my point.
Within the system, or just because as an individual
within this system.
Okay,
well, because any one, like, there is always a diversity, right? Like, it's
can you
never
think
a monolith.
someone can operate from a standpoint, from a philosophical standpoint, and make themselves accessible and take it in and access their community and be that good representative, even if they're not a farmer?
You can start to argue along the lines that, like, what if each MP had like a council of other representatives within, like, what if, like, you elected representatives to, like, debate things and the MP?
Well, you're talking about just like more direct forms of democracy,
yeah,
right? Like, that needs to exist.
That is kind of like, and that is, I mean, the question is how you would balance that without becoming completely ineffective, like still being able to do macro projects without it getting bogged down in the micro.
Yes, because if you talk to like NDP MPs or MPPs right now, they'll tell you they don't actually get a lot of access to that kind of input.
No.
As it's currently structured. So
that's why I say that, like, our parliamentary system is a LARP. It's costumes, it's pretend, it's not real. Like, they have all of these procedures and they have all of these rules and the speaker and yada yada, but at the end of the day, it's fake. It's pretend, it's make believe.
So wouldn't a coalition be the same though? Like, isn't that labor UFO divide?
It would be kind of appealing to what it should be, right? Which is a more representative democracy. Like,
okay, because you come from that South American perspective of coalition governments too, which is something that is not normalized here, and so it's. My brain is not processing it that way. Like, it's just
because you try and do two big things, right?
Yeah,
like if you have an NDP party, a Liberal party, a Conservative party, and these are supposed to represent like three different ideologies, that's still too big of a net. I mean,
okay, what about this Liberal? Okay, so some folks call for a Green NDP merge. Sometimes we hear calls for a Liberal NDP merge.
I think it's still too few parties.
Well, then you're talking
I think we need like 30
reform.
Parties.
Yeah, but our system doesn't. Small parties take so much resources and years to take a foothold anywhere, right? Like, that's where we go back to the needing that huge, big political machinery in order to get those electoral wins.
They do right now. I mean, first of all, it comes back to, as always, proportional representation versus first past the post, and maybe even alternatives to either option, right? Because, like, as long as we have the current voting system that we do, that is in a way a problem.
But that's what your solution is trying to find, not yours. Santiago didn't invent this method, but he is arguing for it. So, like, the UFO labor, where they split and ran in different ridings, is that not a solution to work within these current confines, as long as you can get those two groups to work alongside each other effectively, right? Only one is actually declared a winner, and it's a real power struggle then between two competing.
Well, that would be my idea, is not having a winner. I think having a winner is a problem.
But now you're okay. Okay, so sometimes we are talking about we're working within the confines of our current system, but also that idealist.
Our current system does allow a little bit of, like, theoretically, within our current system, we could have a great deal amount of parties and do coalitions and do things completely radically different.
Would you trust them to look at the coalition that we have right now with Jagmeet and
But that's
Trudeau?
the problem, is that it's a coalition of two people who are, at the end of the day, trying to represent every riding in Canada, which is still a problem, in my opinion. Like, they're still, it's fake. Like if they were to be a lot more specific, I think it would be a different story.
But I think the specificness is in the political position, not the demographic. It's in the socialist message. It's in the...
I'm going to argue something here.
Clearly.
Europe has more coalitions as well, right? There's a lot of places in Europe where, Europe has so many minority governments. It's amazing. And there's a lot of situations where you have, like, socialist and communist parties that have a few seats, not many seats, but a few seats.
Are they effective, though?
Europe is way more socialist policy, right? Europe, there's so many examples of this, right? Like, I could go to Germany and say about, like, their co-determination laws and their worker laws. Like in Germany, that, like, an employer cannot email an employee outside of working hours. It's not allowed. Like, there's stuff like that. And in France, they have, like, so many vacations and public holidays and all of these things. Like, there's a bunch of little things all over the place in Europe that are very different. And a lot of these were won by the few seats controlled by socialists, communists, anarchist parties that have a few representatives in a minority government and leverage that better than they could leverage it here in Canada. And that is better than where we are. It's not perfect, but it is better than where we are right now. And that would be my ideal.
I'm not per se opposed to coalitions. Obviously, I'm opposed to any coalition in current form, just because it would just be neoliberals uniting, and socialists would essentially be pushed out of any coalition that would be created here. It's not that I take issue with. It's, if it's a communist party, if it's a socialist party, or it's an anarchist party, that's different. That's the message we need to hear. Is
I figured it out.
What is it?
sorry. Okay, here's the problem, right? We're talking about segregation based on demographics, right? When the initial sin, you could say, is the segregation by geography, right? This idea, I mean, and this comes back to like what we always talk about in Canada, which is like this idea of like electing people based off of like ridings alone, right? And those people don't fully represent everything, which is the problem, right? But like, if you completely, and this is why we need to reform it. And like I say, I figured it out, but really I'm just parroting something that is already talked about, which is, but
it's okay. You're allowed to figure out things for yourself.
People say that we need reform in terms of like proportional representation, right? But really what we need to do for that to work is have multiple parties representing different things. If you were not voting simply on geographic, right? Like if it wasn't like riding alone, and instead there was a farmers party and the farmers voted for the farmers party and they were allocated an amount of seats based off of the percentage of their vote, then that would be more representative geographically than it actually would be by trying to represent things geographically, if that makes sense. Like,
to me, that's more horrifying. I agree with your premise that having us divided into geographic sections that include quite a lot of people, like 100,000 people is your typical is a Canadian riding, right? And there are, demographically speaking, many different groups represented, needs. But inherent in most of our arguments is that they, save for 1% of them, are all working class people that should be hearing a working class solidarity message, right? They should not picture themselves as a small niche of the working class. And when we think of all these different ways to have people vote, it should be a uniting factor as possible coming from the socialist perspective, right? From a logistical perspective, I don't know how you do that, right? Like it's almost by necessity that we're divided in the way that we are. Like maybe it could be like everyone with the last name, letter A vote, I don't know, but it is ridiculous in assuming that it's some sort of homogenous group. But so would be saying farmers, voting for a farmers group. And
hear me out.
And you still have to find out who is representing that farmers group. What are those values that are being displayed? Because they will be inherently political. So farmers need probably two groups.
I came up with something. I just came up with something. Okay, it doesn't. I don't know if this exists. Okay, you have two votes, right? The first vote is a party vote, right? So you have a farmers party, a labor's party, like a capitalist asshole party, a whatever. You have like, say 20 parties, okay? And then you vote, and we kept the 338. So you figure out how many percentage is equal to one seat, right? So you do that, and then they get allocated an amount of seats. Then you go to a second vote, and this vote is within those parties, you vote for candidates. So like if you voted for farmers and farmers got 10 seats, then you vote amongst a pool which 10 farm people you want to be the representatives there. And it's not perfect because democracy never is, but like that kind of works better.
It does kind of exist, right? You're talking
kind of, but not like that.
No, but in the idea that you get a broader vote, a party vote, and a more localized vote. So you do still get a local representative, but also you have a say in the larger, so that actually the result is proportional to the popular vote, right? That's the problem with our voting system right now, is where you could actually get the majority of votes and not even win in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, you're definitely talking about electoral reform here, and then it's like an issue to revisit for sure. But, I'm curious when we talk to James just to see like what it was like when those groups then met up in, the Ontario framework, and working within the Canadian system.
I think UFO, though, they did advocate for it.
They do wrong that we can learn from.
Yeah. What can we learn from them right and wrong? It's like what not to do, what to do.
I'm sure that's what people get from our discussions, too.
But, like, I mean, the whole point of this, though, like, okay, I'm advocating, I guess, now. I've figured it out. I'm advocating for electoral reform, but without electoral reform.
Fair Vote Canada is ecstatic.
Like, what I'm saying is we have this existing contradiction, right?
Yeah.
Of our current system being that it is segregationalist based on arbitrary rules of geographic boundaries that are drawn up that are not at all. I mean, it's really a metaphor.
And class. Like you mentioned it earlier, that like a trans person would not feel welcome in the Conservative Party.
Yeah. So
for the most part, you know.
But like, that's not something that is baked necessarily into the electoral system. That's just the consequence of ideological, like the way what we've done with that electoral system.
Yeah, I mean, it just refutes the claim that any current Canadian party even assumes they represent everyone. Well, the Liberals, actually, the Liberals, I think, in the NDP do try to say they represent absolutely everyone. NDP would be like asterisk, not Galen Weston. Right? Like, but
they would still say small businesses we represent, and you know, like they'd still be like, oh, and we're like they're still friendly to corporations. Like they're not.
I think it's just people participating in greedflation, right? Yeah. That's very specific to our enemy.
They'll have individuals that they're against, but they won't have larger systemic problems necessarily. But I guess my point being that like that initial contradiction of the geographic division means that no matter what, if absent of electoral reform, we're stuck with that, right? So
it's a strategy for sure. Like even if the NDP were to create a wing, you know, I'm not advocating for this because that party is toxic and I wouldn't want it to replicate itself in any shape or form. But I mean, like maybe just as a party, you recognize that you can't effectively capture all of those votes with the way that you are, with your current brand, even if that's the problem. So what do you got to do to appeal to that rural vote?
So one thing you just said, though, like wing, right? Like what if they created a wing, I guess, right?
Yeah, but don't, because we don't like them.
We know that's bad, right? But like, that's exactly what I'm talking about here, is like they could have internally systems where they represent different people, but they're centralized.
Yeah, see, this is where you're bringing me along. See, a wing of a party so that there's already structure to work together. Because, you know, power-hungry people, like, I don't know, I'm glad coalitions work in other places, but these people don't even work good together. Like, I just...
But that's the point, is that let's drop the pretending, right? Like a wing would be pretend. It would be saying that we're doing this when we don't really.
Okay, I'm not talking about the wing of the NDP, though. I'm talking about like you created a party for the purpose of being able to represent everybody, but not under this single branding and structure.
Well, it wouldn't, because it's impossible under capitalism. Right. Yeah. And beyond capitalism, it's impossible under our current electoral system, our current parliamentary democracy. It is impossible. Right. So we advocate for the complete change of those systems, but in absence of that, and I mean, I guess you could argue that it's not even worth talking about in absence of it, because like,
here we
what's
are again.
The point of wasting time there? Burn it all down to the ground. And like, like, yes,
we got to the same place at the same time, and this is why we work together so wonderfully.
But that's the point, is that like, okay, burn it down, yes, but if we're philosophically, for the purpose of debate, entertaining for a second the idea of like it functioning in any way before it gets burnt down, which it doesn't, and this won't work because none of it works without complete reform, then the idea of having multiple parties is a bit more honest than trying to like have different wings and have it's a bit better. It's shit, but it's a little bit better.
Okay, we're going to have to agree to disagree on that particular point, because I'm sold on the more wing, but not of a current existing political system. Because the only way I would be even entering this four-way, even hypothetically, is if there was something other than the NDP to facilitate this.
The problem is that we have such weak rules around what is allowed inside of a party, right? Like, parties essentially decide their own structure. They're authoritarian. Parties are so fucking authoritarian, right? Like, within a party, everything is allowed. You can veto as many candidates as you want. You can control everything. You don't have to listen to any of your caucuses or this or that. Like, all the decisions are so centralized. So,
but that's the flaw.
They're like I said, they're pretend. They're a LARP. I'm going to start calling everything a LARP. I don't know why, but like, that is what it is. They're pretend. So, given that, I don't think, like, even if we had a new party and we tried to, like, have it so, like, oh, well, we're having different wings and caucuses and yada yada and different sects, like, the party is actually like almost a coalition within a party. Well, the coalition can't exist within a party because the party itself is so authoritarian in structure that somebody will inevitably abuse it.
It doesn't have to be, though. I don't think it has to be. Elections Canada doesn't mandate that it be.
But it will.
Don't crush my dreams. Don't.
This is the anarchist in me, is the lack of faith in if you give them centralized
power. I'm abandoning electoral politics altogether, and I don't even want to have this conversation then.
But that's the thing.
Sharpen
is that, like,
the guillotine.
Centralized party power will be abused. There'll be somebody, you'll get Alex Terrell in power who will say, well, I have to do this because it's the right way, and you fools don't know what you're doing. And then, like, well-meaning as it may be, you know, like, it will, that's what'll happen, because the
but you see
people
where we are? Neither of us have any faith in this system at all.
Because I know that people who have authoritarian tendencies pursue power, and people who are not authoritarian don't want power. And so the people who will pursue the positions of power within that will inevitably be authoritarian, because do you or I want power? Are we saying that we should be leader? No, like, I don't want to be leader.
No.
But like, that's kind of the point, is that, like, fuck. Like,
and that's what got you really excited about UFO, though, right? Like, was the...
Yeah, well, that they didn't want to be...
we win, but... So they won the election, but they didn't... But there was a prime minister, eventually they did, but the idea that they believed that a leaderless movement was more ideal, right? And then that's a separate discussion altogether, but, like, let's cut it here just for now, because I think that was good. I think eventually we came to a place that's not the same place, but in the end... we came to the same conclusion. Flames.